there, this is Troy Yamaguchi for Eclipse TCG. I'm here today live from Las Vegas. I don't have my typical setup with me, so I apologize for the laptop camera and laptop microphone. But I wanted to make sure I got out my final opinions on the Galactic Championship format and give an update to the video that I put out about a week and a half ago where I talked about the various decks in the format, where I thought they were strong, where I thought they were weak, and where I thought everyone's relative position was. My general opinions on what the decks represent and like what they are accomplishing has not changed very much since then. There have been a couple like deck list major shifts occurring. I'll try to talk a little bit more about that when I get into the tier list itself. But what's changed majorly is like what I currently think the solution to the format that most players are adopting is, and how that kind of warps the rest of the metagame around it. So that's what we'll be talking about today. You know, this is the most enjoyable and interesting part about any sort of metagame analysis. The proof is always in the pudding. At this event, we will see which answers are popular, and then eventually, like, which ones will be successful. So that's what we'll be talking about today, and I want to make sure I give, like, you know, my most updated thoughts on the format. This is going to be kind of a quicker video. Rather pressed for time, and like again, the changes that I've experienced have not been like all too different from where I was about a week and a half ago, but I will still try to give my comprehensive opinion as it is. Just a real quick announcement. I will be on one of the official Galactic Championship panels, which is really cool. This is the Compete panel. I have a number of fellow, you know, competitors, content creators that you may be familiar with at the time. I'll be up there as well, you know. So if you're at the event, come check it out. I'm not 100% sure if it'll be streamed. I imagine it will be, but you know, look out for that. You'll get to see me. You know, it means I'm a valid Star Wars Unlimited pundit, and that means everything I say is true. So you should listen to me. I don't know. It'll be a fun time. Okay, I just have a tier list this week. Before I jump into where everyone's positioned, let me try to give a general update to my thoughts on the format from last time. In the last video, I was talking about how I thought Cad Bane's position in the meta was a little bit shaky, and I talked about all the various threats that people are bringing to Cad Bane. The one that was popular about a week and a half ago was the Mandalorian. It was like really much on the upswing and like sustained itself in that position as I think it was like the second most played deck at the time. So I was emphasizing like that deck's position and how that deck put a lot of pressure on the meta and warped the meta around itself, because the Mandalorian is a very like powerful deck, but it has like specific matchups that it just cannot win. Okay, so that was the theme of that video. Since that time, people have adapted to the Mandalorian. I thought the Mandalorian's position, you know, if the tournament was that weak, seemed to be strong going into that event, but in about the week since, and probably if it were the case that tournament occurred, you know, when that video was posted, just based on the trends since then, a lot of the more popular decks that have been on the rise are very, very good into the Mandalorian. And so that deck's position is far, far weaker now. It hasn't been able to answer those questions. And during that video, I discussed, you know, my extreme doubts on whether or not it would be able to answer those questions favorably. So that's kind of shaken out. Mandalorian has not proven itself to be able to adapt to two decks on this tier list that I think are much better positioned now, or are going to be especially popular going into this event just because they responded well to the last cycle of meta. And those two decks are Ahsoka Blue for one, and Vader Yellow for the other. These two decks are seeing much higher play rates online, and I do expect these rates to be sustained going into this event, because I actually just think that these two decks are pretty good answers to the format in general. So this week, I'll be trying to frame the format in that context and try to explain, okay, the answer a week and a half ago was Mando, as for like this like Cad Bane space, you know, I talked about the pillars of the format. I thought the main decks were Cad Bane, space and pilot decks, blue-green hero, blue-green villain, and control. That has kind of shifted around somewhat. There's some up and downs there. So this week, I think the metagame shifts are like these aggressive decks are more popular. Ahsoka Blue is on the rise very much so. Vader Yellow's position looks really good. And so these are the new things that are putting pressure on the format and forcing decks to change around them. Okay, so let's start at the top of the tier list here. Cad Bane Blue, despite everything that's occurred in the fluctuations in the meta, I still do expect this to be the most popular leader-based pair. But that's a very like tenuous, line of thinking for me right now. I think if it is indeed the highest leader base pair, and I think it is very much threatened by, Ahsoka and Vader, which are on the rise and like are powerful decks and well situated in the format. If it is the highest leader base pair, I expect this to be a pretty small margin, something to the tune of 1% or 2%, as opposed to last year where Hantu Blue at day 2 of the GC was like 23% of the room, and the next most popular deck was like a 7%er. So very much so. This metagame is somehow still defined by Cad Bane just because the strength of the Blue Sentinels is such a like imposing barrier on the format for other ground-based strategies that Cad Bane remains a meta warping force, but its hold on the meta is so much weaker than other like highest leader base pairs than like other formats in the past that I expect I could very easily see a world where this is either not the highest leader base pair at this tournament, or like going forward into the Ashes of Empire meta is like no longer the Boogeyman deck. This deck is not imposing as strict restrictions on the format as something like even like Boba Fett Lake Country from last set, where it was like, this was a stat check deck. If you couldn't beat this deck, your deck, go home basically. The alternative hypotheses to this Cad Bane Blue deck are quite powerful. It's very difficult, I think, for this deck to answer a lot of its questions favorably. And the things that you have to do to this deck to like have it work within its own meta that it's created are really interesting. So what this Cad Bane deck is having to do is it has to put a bunch of cards in its deck that are not exactly anti-synergy, but they're just like not part of the deck's core board control identity. Like this deck really wishes it could just play Sentinels every turn of the game and just like have that be its core game plan, but because of what the meta has become in terms of people going to space and just trying to like go around or through the Sentinels, it's having to put cards like 000, Ogdo Bogdo, Hona has made the deck list in a lot of cases for this Cad Bane deck, and just kind of like play a little bit more of like the new SWU type of gameplay of like, okay, we're just going to race each other, and I'm going to put, I see Corellian Hounds as an answer in this Cad Bane deck quite frequently, so like all these racing cards that are not part of his core board control type of like plan A game plan is like part of what this Cad Bane deck is becoming going into this GC. So it's really interesting that that's what's happening to Cad Bane, and it's pretty much in response to the like other decks in the room that are trying to beat him. So he's having to like kind of like pull himself towards their strategy, as opposed to the other way around, so that's the Cad Bane world. In general, I still think that this deck is like has weaknesses into space. I think if someone brings a Cad Bane deck list that is just favored into space game 1 and has a side up plan for the other greedy decks in the room, for the mirror match, for Director Krennic, stuff like that, I think this deck could be really, really like well situated ultimately. But like I am generally suspicious of this deck's ability to combat space, and if it does not answer this question favorably, or if the things that Cad Bane has to do to its deck list to compete with space are warping it so much so that it's losing its strengths into the other decks in the room, which are, Ahsoka, Krennic, and the other greedy decks, I think this deck will have a general like underperformance at GC. I think Hantu Blue was like twice the deck that this was in general, and like even had like a fine matchup spread in general, and even that deck did very poorly at the Galactic Championship last year. So very much questioning this Cad Bane's position right now. I think it's a soft like quote unquote best deck in the format. I would not even be surprised if this thing was eventually dethroned as like the best like answer in Ash's format, but like nonetheless it still feels like very difficult to just straight disrespect this deck, because I think everyone is generally of the opinion that it will be the most popular leader base pair, just because like its card quality is so high, even if its metagame position is weak. So really, really weird kind of situation for Cad Bane going into this tournament. It imposes a lot of restrictions on the format that it then has to like circumvent. Like you have to pull out things like Droid Laser Turret or like the Bith Brute or like the additional Sentinels on 3 to play these racing cards, which then like it's almost like you kicked out all of the like ground racing aggro decks that are not named Ahsoka. Like this deck kicks out Tobias, it kicks out Yularen, it kicks out decks in that vein that were existing in the previous format, like all the aggressive negotiation ground-based decks from the previous format, are just Lando Lake Country even. Like this deck has ejected those decks from the format. So now that that's the case, it's like, okay, well now I can just like take the cards out of my deck that were good against that deck and prepare myself for the next rotation of the meta. So it's a pretty interesting thing that's happening to this Cad Bane deck. Nonetheless, I still think that all the decks that I mentioned as having been ejected from the metagame are still like mostly illegal, just because Cad Bane's like core game plan is still intact probably, despite all of the weird cards that they're putting in their deck now that deviate from its original like purpose. So that's like what Cad Bane's position is going into this format. It's really interesting. I think it's an adaptation that this deck has to make, because if this deck does not adapt, it will just die to space decks and like the other aggressive decks in the room. So pretty interesting, and I'm excited to see like how Cad Bane ends up shaking out, or like what the best version will end up being at the end of the day. I think the deck plays, I don't know, solidly, consistently. It's still a good strategy. It has Pre-Vizsla Chimera in it. Like these are all good traits. But in general, I'm like looking out for the opportunity to say, okay, no, this deck has fallen, and we can now like kind of disrespect it and shift ourselves back to something closer to the previous metagame. So okay, that's Cad Bane. I want to talk about the aggressive decks. I'm going to table Ahsoka for now. I want to talk about the space decks especially. These decks have a very good metagame position, basically off the back of Cad Bane. Not only is Cad Bane soft into space and having to warp itself to even compete with those decks, in the main board, but because Cad Bane is like a natural predator to all of the ground-based aggro strategies, the space decks get a much better matchup spread in general, because what happened about a week and a half ago when I was talking about Mandalorian and friends is that the predominant strategy to address Cad Bane was to go greedy and to try to go over the top of it. That's why you saw Krennic saw, a little bit of an uptick in play, and the Mandalorian was like the in vogue deck at the time. Okay, well, the space decks walk all over those decks more or less, just because they generate so much velocity. Darth Vader is just too active, too many, you just spit out so many guys. Like the greedy decks don't get the chance to play the game a lot of the time, especially the Mandalorian. Krennic as well, I think, his game plan is like rather passive, so when Vader is just spitting out its whole hand and hitting your base, you're kind of stressed. And then Boba Fett especially, like this deck is resilient into hyperspace disasters, so it takes away like one of the answers that these greedy decks try to have to win back the board. It's just you're a burn deck, so like yes, they can hyperspace away all of your ships, but you can flip your leader on the ground, deal 4 damage, and develop 9 power worth of guys. Like they still have to address that next turn. You're just going to play more burn ships, Fed's fire spray, like their board's still going to be empty, and then it's just the Devastator show from there. So that's generally where these decks are positioned, like beneficiary so much of Cad Bane's position. Cad Bane kicking out the Yularans of the world, which were typically a bad matchup for Boba Fett and Vader last format. Tobias as well, same thing. And like Chewbacca was like another deck that could be very suspicious for both Vader and Boba. So in general, that's why these space decks are well positioned. And I think they just have like a pretty good general matchup spread going into this event. I'm like, there's definitely been an uptick in space in the last week or so of preparation. It's also very easy to end up on these decks, I think, from a theory perspective, because this is so much a metagame where every deck has some sort of like really terrible like time bomb matchup that's waiting for them in Swiss. And the space decks are the ones that say, you know what, I want to put as much pressure on my opponent as possible and, be the active threat in the room, and if I roll my good matchups, I'll win. If I roll, a bad matchup, I'll lose. But like most of your bad matchups, as I keep saying, have been ejected from the format. So the Vader, Boba, and even Luke's of the world, I think, are quite happy going into this tournament. The only thing you're really afraid of is that space is always a strategy that is vulnerable to preparation, right? Even in the Lawless Time format, if you are heads up whatsoever, that space exists. That you have to be prepared to space. You have some kind of game plan about into space, right? So. That's its only weakness in the format, but that's just like a core part of the space strategy. I think the Vader deck is better positioned now than I think it's ever been, pretty much since the deck existed. I think this deck is in very good shape, and it's like increased play rate over the past week speaks to this. Not only is this deck pretty good into Cad Bane, I mean, they have to draw a pretty diabolical curve to, keep in the game. And even if, as I mentioned to like the Metafy group and like my teammates, like we've had testing sessions of this into Cad Bane where Cad Bane can open, Hullcraft on 2 resources, collateral damage on 3 resources, and then IG 2000 on 4 resources. Like, just answer, answer, answer at every point in the curve. And then, like, eventually what ends up happening is Vader sticks himself on anything. Like, you can put your leader on a TIE fighter and it's threatening, and the Cad Bane deck will just have its base touched a couple times by the Vader, and then they're out of game. Like, it is typically what ends up happening. So this deck is pretty well positioned. It's powerful, and its play rate has increased as a result. I also think that this Vader deck is pretty well situated against the Boba Fett matchup. You just have space dominance over them. Their ability to race you is limited to their ground threats, basically. Their 2 costs are very powerful against you. Both Pride and Cyril are quite scary cards. 000 is scary as well, but you have counterplay in that you have the ability to pretty much deprive them of spaceships because your deck should be prepared to fight other space decks going into this tournament, including the mirror match. Boba Fett, of course, will be in the room. So you have game into Boba Fett. It's surprising to me that there is such a disparity between the matchup statistics from A Lawless Time and what is communicated to me by players who have tested this matchups themselves, that like know maybe a thing or two more about Vader than the average Vader player. In terms of Vader's like ability to have counterplay in this matchup. So historically, the data has always shown that Boba Fett is very favored into Vader, but as we've seen from the major that Vader ended up winning, where it ran through like 3 or 4 Boba Fetts, and as is communicated to me by people that have tested this matchup extensively, like it's more playable than the stats would have you believe. It's at least 50-50. Like people even intimate to me that it's Vader favored, which I'm amenable to agree with, just because again, you have so much space control, so many space ambushers, so many ways to deprive them of their powerful flip, and their only real recourse is to race you on the ground with, admittedly they're quite powerful ground units in Cyril, Pride, 000, but that's like kind of what's going on in this deck's position. The other thing that Vader really enjoys about this format is the increased popularity of Ahsoka. So Ahsoka is very much on the rise in the most past week or two. I think just because its matchup spread looks human, I think this deck is quite powerful. It's has game into pretty much everything. It's usually in the game just because your flip turn outputs so much damage, and the just raw card quality of the blue-green hero pool of cards lets you compete with pretty much anything mid-range or higher. Like, you're never out of the game, just off rip as this Ahsoka deck. So there's a lot of good things happening here. Your leader ability being free gives you a lot of card activity and a lot of ability to contest board. It's actually pretty frequent that against Cad Bane, your card quality in the early game is on par or higher than his. The only problem in that matchup is that your burden to like eke out an advantage is much higher than Cad Bane's because they have inevitability over you. So you have all of the tools to compete with Cad Bane early, which like very few mid-range decks can say, just because Lots Razi is a house of a card. Obi-Wan blocks their like Cyril Karn, so it takes away that as a good threat. I mean, Lots Razi blows up Cyril Karn as well, so like it takes away one of their best starts against you. Your ability being free just like enables you to tack on more damage onto their board than they can deal with sometimes. So you have all the tools in the early game to go toe-to-toe with Cad Bane, which is very, very good. But if you do not like develop a very strong board advantage and then push a strong flip turn through their Sentinels, of which they have many, but of which some of them are no longer in the deck list. Like a lot of people are skimping on, for example, Droid Laser Turret, but you have no guarantee that that's the Cad Bane that will be sitting across from you today. But if you're not able to do all of that, Ahsoka can get the Cad Bane deck to like 25, 27 damage, and a Chimera will hit the board, and the game will become like completely unwinnable quite quickly. So that's Ahsoka's problem into the Cad Bane matchup. The burden of your draw and the burden of your execution is relatively high, but you have the tools to go toe-to-toe with them. But you're not favored into the other rising force in the meta, which is Vader. But everything else on this list is very, very manageable. I think the Boba Fett matchup is Ahsoka favored a little bit. The Luke matchup is basically just the same thing as the Boba Fett matchup. I don't know. Your deck is so explosive. Your leader ability outputs so much damage for no resource cost. Your ability to contend with Krennic is quite high. You have Galen Call Credit, which is very, very strong. So this Ahsoka deck has all the tools and has the markings of a very strong deck. Its only like real Swiss like enemy is Vader, just because the yellow removal matches up well into your game plan. And Clone Combat Squadron is a horrifying card that demands that you have removal, which your deck does not play a ton of. It's like 40 units and like some upgrades and like 3 to 5 events. That's like the Ahsoka deck. So this deck's quite powerful. I think a lot of people are landing on it just like as an alternative to Cad, because Cad is weak into space. Ahsoka is weak into Vader specifically, but strong against Boba, strong against Luke, and I think probably pretty good against Red Yellow Hero. So the Ahsoka deck's position is pretty good. It just has a Vader problem, and the Cad Bane matchup is, I think, a little bit soft. I think it might even shade towards unfavored if they play the build with like as many Sentinels as they can fit in their deck. So that's Ahsoka's position. I like this deck quite a bit. I think as far as like decks with bad matchups on this tier list goes, it's one of the ones with the more like solvable problems. But I am decently afraid to take a bad Vader matchup going into this tournament, just because I think it's a very easy deck for people to land on, and I think they're even like correct to do so. Like my opinion on Vader this format is higher than it is pretty much in any format since the deck existed, and maybe even in that format as well. So generally that's what's happening with this Ahsoka deck. So that's tier 1. Still, as I keep saying, mostly described by Cad Bane's position and the metagame like influence that Cad Bane holds. It's like a lot of people just having to bring like alternative solutions to the metagame, mostly in the form of space, and then Ahsoka is like a decent like all-arounder deck that only has one, I think, pretty unfavorable matchup in Darth Vader. But if you have one unfavorable matchup, that's much easier to solve than if you have like a slew of unfavored matchups. So speaking of decks with like good or bad matchups, let's go down to tier 2. I've actually promoted Luke Skywalker from, I think last time on the tier list I referred to him as like kind of the last stop in terms of like decks that I thought were generally good picks going into this event, or strong decks. I still think that this Luke deck is rather underwhelming. Your card quality is not very high. Your ability to output aggression is not as high as the other pilots. Your deck is a bit slow. I mean, Luke just flips so late and does not even output quite as much damage as you really would hope so. You don't have like big, powerful units like Fire Spray, and like Punishing One does a ton of damage, or Clone Combat Squadron, or Victory. Like all these units are far more impressive than what Luke is able to accomplish. But what Luke's metagame position is that it is just yet another space strategy, except it has a very, 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 very favored matchup into Darth Vader. Darth Vader, I really like don't even know what starts you can have to like have the game feel playable into Luke. Like almost every like 3 resource situation looks really crap for Darth Vader. It's quite bad. You need something very specific, like starting the 2/2 shielded with initiative opposite like the 3/2 guy. Like if you can do that, you can probably like ambush ship them out of the game and like have some sort of gameplay there. But like short of that, like most of your starts are really, really weak to Luke starts. Like their ships are just marginally better than yours, and their leader ability trades with your leader ability, and your leader ability is far more important to your deck than theirs is. So that's generally what's going on with this Luke guy. Pretty much the same into Cad Bane as Boba Fett and Vader. Like it's just another space deck. There's not a whole ton different going on. Weaker into Mandalorian and probably Krennic as well, just because they have hyperspace in their deck. Like, but it's probably still fine. Like against Krennic, their deck is so slow. Like you can probably just slaughter them in space. It's fine. Just an aggro deck, but in general, that's like Luke's position right now. Its main like weakness as opposed to the other pilots, which have Vader has a very good Mandalorian matchup. Boba Fett's is about 50-50. It's like not upset about seeing the Mandalorian. It's probably like not super happy. It's fine. Luke is, I think, pretty soft into the Mandalorian just because Hammerhead does so much work against your deck. And like I said, the deck is a little bit slower and has no reach. You have no burn ships in this deck as opposed to Boba Fett. So that's where it's getting like some of its ups and downs. I think this deck is also like weaker into Ahsoka. It's closer to Boba than Vader, right? Vader as the space deck has the good Ahsoka matchup. Boba has a pretty weak Ahsoka matchup in my opinion. Luke is probably closer to the Boba side than Vader. You don't even have topple like Boba does, so you don't even have like that way to victory. I think it's probably just like a losing matchup in general, but you do have advantages into the other rising star, which is Vader, so that's good. I have to give Luke a little bit of a promotion this week in the tier list because I don't think he's like a horrible deck to be picking. I think going to space for this event makes sense. It's fine, and this is like a space deck that just has like one like awesome like counter matchup. It's like a assassin type deck. So I think its position is actually quite fine going into this event. So that's Luke. Hey there, this is Troy from about like 40 minutes in the future. On my previous point, we took a look at this matchup just because I think that it's important to find the best anti-space space deck. And generally what happens is Vader's way to victory is just, stick a ship that doesn't like immediately die. Like the 2-2 shielded is probably the best one. And then just like literally play a space ambusher every single turn of the game for as long as you can. And Luke pretty much doesn't get to play the game either in this instance. And like if you manage to kill their ship with initiative, you get a token and they don't get to ping it. Like that's pretty good. So that's like Vader's path to victory. It's a little bit more practical than just throwing up your hands and saying it's an auto loss. It's not an auto loss. It's just generally pretty strenuous to draw this many ambushers and like this much space interaction, but the Vader deck should be prepared to have a lot of space interaction just because space versus space is going to be an important force in the metagame. That's like generally what's happening. I don't know. It's just like space decks fighting each other. I think we can all move on with our lives. I don't want to speak anymore on this matchup. This Krennic deck, again, just like the question mark for me is just like, can this deck compete with the space decks whatsoever? You can put all sorts of like, funny cards in your deck. You can like try to hyperspace them early. You can try to lawbringer them early. I just like don't know how much that matters, because you're still just getting run over. The deck does not do a whole lot of anything in the early game and is just fairly passive. Like you might have, if you hit like your double ramp curve, like maybe that helps you play the game, right? If you just go like bounty hunter crew, the bounty hunter mercenary, was it replaceable mercenary, whatever, the fake super laser technician, into resupply carrier, flip your leader, put a craving power on something, swing your resupply carrier over their space units. Like that curve might get you there probably, but it's inconsistent. So I really just don't know if this deck can consistently beat space. If it can, then this deck's fantastic, but that's just like not been my experience playing as or against it. It felt like it was too slow, too passive, and like too like reliant on its prayers, like is generally my opinion of this Krennic deck. I do think that with the Cad Bane deck shifting like more aggressive and more like racing centric, that does actually favor the Krennic deck because you might be able to get some inevitability over them in game one. So that's good. A lot of the Cad Banes are also like eschewing single reactor ignition, which is very good in these greedy matchups, just because if they have a board wipe in their deck and you don't, they can kind of like play to reel you in, kind of play to make you commit multiple bombs and just wipe the board, reset the board, and like get all the tempo back. So in general, the field for Krennic looks fine. I think this deck is good. I think this deck is totally an acceptable pick, but I've just never been a fan of the way that it plays, although, its ability to emulate something like Kylo Ren Data Vault or Yoda Data Vault from the previous format in terms of the games you draw double ramp feel like quite unlosable against many decks. Ahsoka is a matchup where I think your colors are generally good against theirs because like the blue-green villain deck is just greedier and taller than the blue-green hero deck. So if you live, you'll have inevitability over them. Like, that's good. I mean, you also have Chimera Vizsla in your deck, just like Cad Bane does. But, like, your Sentinel quality is not as high, and your ability to trade board is not as high, and your activity in the early game is not as high. So those are all bad traits in this Ahsoka matchup. And plus, like, add to all this, they have Galen Cult Credit, which I have to assume is quite horrifying for this Krennic deck. Turns off probably a lot of their strong lines. Like in the games that I've played it, that's been my experience. So I don't know what their response to Galen is if they have a good one. So it's like another matchup that seems quite questionable to me. God forbid the Ahsoka deck start like one of its Neil Han starts, and you're just like taking 12 damage before you get to play the game. So more question marks for this Krennic deck than I would care for, but I do think it has advantages going into this tournament as compared to last week. Maybe like, you do like that the Cad Bane deck is warping itself, and you do like that Mandalorian is not a strong play going into this event. Those are like the only two saving graces, but like if the rest of the metagame slants aggressive, I don't think you're very happy about that. I think the deck is too passive. That's just my opinion. So I expect this deck to be around. It's on the decline in terms of like the play rates that I've seen online. So I think most people are just like preferring to go, like I said earlier in the video, the hypothesis a couple weeks ago was like try to go over the Cad Bane deck and be greedier than it. I don't think that idea is very good, just because when the rest of the meta opts to go faster and more aggressive, then you're left holding the bag, and punished for Cad Bane's sins, more or less. So I think that's Krennic's meta position, but I do think this deck is like one of the better ideas. And I mean, if your deck is good in space, I think your deck is good at this tournament. I think that's like generally my opinion going into this event. So if that can be solved for Krennic, it looks probably quite fantastic. But as I keep saying, I am very skeptical of its ability to do that. Okay, let's talk about the Mandalorian. I've kind of referenced it a number of times in terms of its meta position to this point. I think this deck is quite weak going into this event. I was high on it a week and a half ago, just based on like what things were being played and all of that sort of thing. I think that you hate that Ahsoka and Vader are on the rise. That's like generally like the only thing that matters for this deck, because this deck like mega slams most everything else. Its inherent power level is just so broken. Like this deck is so powerful, but if you cannot beat these matchups that exist in Swiss, and I expect Ahsoka and Vader to be like top three strategies along with Cad Bane, like I just don't think your matchup spread looks very good at all, and I've yet to see a list that can compete with those decks reliably. Like you do have some feasible curve to beat Vader, because they can't go double one drop against you very comfortably and lose to Let's Call It War. And then against the Shethapede, which is like their answer to Let's Call It War, you have Crushing Blow, draw, and then you have the 3/1 a ship in your deck as like another answer to Vader's shenanigans, right? You don't really have a clean out to the 2/2 shielded guy outside of Crushing Blow, which is like whatever. I just think in general that matchup is too weak for the Mandalorian to be able to feel comfortable at this event. Nonetheless, I do expect this deck to be in the room, and if it can hit its good matchups, which is not totally out of the question, then this deck can just kind of like free roll its way up into the tournament, just like depending on what's doing well. But with everything I know right now, I just don't feel nearly as confident recommending this deck as I did previously, just because the metagame shifts do not favor it, right? A lot of the metagame shifts are in direct response to Mando's position a week and a half ago with the Ahsoka and Vader on the rise, and obviously you're not a big fan of that. And then finally here, taking Luke's place as like I think the last stop in terms of decks that I think are good is this like red yellow hero idea. This deck has always felt very low ceiling to me and kind of like unimpressive in terms of like what it's doing. I refer to it as a draft deck. I think it's playing a lot of like subpar cards that don't do a whole lot. You have advantages in that you have Blue Ace in your deck, so against space you do have the ability to try to go toe to toe with them and have space control through that card. That card's quite good. In Greef especially, Blue Ace clears their hauler for free. Like awesome, you love that. And then against the Ahsoka ground aggro deck, you have something like Sabine, the Sabine unit, which is like cunning on legs, which is quite broken. So like those are some good qualities to the deck, but in general, I'm just like not very high on this deck's power level, but some like get back here. It does enjoy the more space-centric metagame. I think Ahsoka is maybe a winning matchup. I don't know about that. It seems I'm just always so skeptical of saying that this deck has a winning matchup, because I think its like power level is just generally lower than a lot of the things on this list. But this deck is not terrible. It has a path to victory. I don't know if Greef or Ezra is the better version. I don't know. Ezra has Saboteur, like this is good. Greef has like Sabine being cunning, which is good, and like its ambushers trade up a little bit harder. But like outside of that, I think the Greef deck is still rather boneless. At least that's been my opinion of it pretty much since people started playing it, and I haven't seen reason to alter this opinion really. But we'll see how this deck performs at the GC. I would not expect like glowing reviews of this, but like it is still one of the like more realistic decks that you could expect to play at this tournament, so you want to still be aware of it. I think you want to test a little bit into it, but I think most everything else on this tier list is more threatening than red yellow hero at this time. So that's like the general organization of the metagame and my understanding of it going into this tournament. Rogue is just like just infinite variants of the above archetypes. I talked about this a little bit in the previous video. If we split the metagame into its pillars, you'll have like other red blue villain decks, like you'll have like a Talzin in the room of some kind. Like the only advantage of playing the Force engine in this red blue villain deck is that it gives you advantage into Ahsoka, but like you probably give up more into the space matchups. Like I just don't think it's a strong strategy altogether. The blue-green villains of the world, you have Aura Singh, which is more advantaged into space, worse into Cad Bane probably, because the deck is like less, there's just like no unfair factor to it, so you probably just lose in a mid-range battle. So plenty of like other versions of these decks running around, but like these are the main strategies you can probably expect to play at the Galactic Championship. The only one that is a notable exception, and just like playing the game completely different, is the Cad Bane Yellow guy. I mean, this guy's falling off the tier list. I want to put him in Babu Frikdom, but I do just need to recommend that you test against this deck a couple of times, experience the frustration of having your entire hand discarded, and then realize that kind of doesn't matter if you're able to build a winning board anyway, because this deck does not do very much of anything, because it is Cad Bane without any of its good cards in it. It's just like trying to make sure that you also don't have any good cards in your deck, because they're all in the graveyard. But I don't think that's a real way to play the game. I don't think this deck is very good. I don't think it does much of anything. So I just, very frustrating to play against and lose to. So please just, if you are preparing for this tournament, dedicate 45 minutes of your day to just doing your homework checks so that it doesn't derail your tournament. That's my general recommendation. Just be aware that this deck exists and plays the game in like a weird kind of, discard heavy way. Okay, so that's the tier list that I expect going into GC in general. In terms of Foresight, I want to give like some, I guess, ups and downs to my predictions from last week. These are still just like totally vibe based guesses. I have no, claim that this is exactly what the format is going to look like. But I do expect space to be high up. I think this is the primary like response to the Cad Bane defined format that people are going to bring. This is, I think, what the community has like generally settled on. We went this kind of like odyssey of like people trying like the heavy space decks at the beginning, and then we like kind of got distracted by greedy decks, and then now we're just back to pilots and all this sort of junk. So I've bumped it up. I think I had it like at 18% last week, but I didn't include red yellow hero in this skew, so that would have been like what 22% last week, including red yellow hero. So I have it as about like a third of the room. I think anywhere from about a fourth to a third of the room. I could even see like a little more than a third, like maybe as much as 40% of the room being just like some kind of space strategy is like pretty real. I think this is the best position that space has had pretty much since Boba Lake Country was introduced for the first time. So I think that's what's going on. I think there are also just like more space decks running around that are not Boba Fett Lake Country than usual. And part of that is just like the decks that Boba is kind of like so into get like mega slammed by Vader, just because Boba is a tall like burn based space deck and Vader is a wide and faster kind of like momentum based space deck. So I think all of this in consideration is what's like going to be the primary story of this tournament. I expect space to be like how well your deck beats space is going to be, I think, one of the most important considerations of this event. I don't know how well space will perform ultimately at this event, but I do expect, I just have this like vision of somebody literally just sleeving up their Boba Fett deck that they had lying around from the previous format, 3-0ing draft because they got past some broken cards, and like just kind of like walking their way into top cut. I can like totally see that happening at this tournament, just because the metagame is like like totally in question, and like space is just pretty well positioned. So that's my general opinion going into this. Cad Bane, I think, is a little bit weaker this week. I think that the like increased space threat should scare some people off this Cad Bane deck, but nonetheless, I still do expect it to be the highest leader-based pair. Blue-green villain, I think, just because, again, I don't think it answers its space question very well, should be a little bit lower, but the Krennic deck is still around, and I think still popular, and maybe even like a good pick for this event, just depending on its position into space. But in general, the only other deck that I think is like up in terms of its representation is like blue-green hero, just with Ahsoka being a good response to at least half of the space decks, and going even with Cad, or maybe like giving up a little bit of percent into Cad. But I think this Ahsoka deck, just because it has a little bit more of an even matchup spread than a lot of the other decks on this list, is going to be like a very popular choice at this event. It's also a fun deck to play. It's also quite explosive, so I think this is like a pretty good pick for the event. And I think where if you want to be aggressive and you don't want a space deck, this is, I think, where most people are going to land. And then finally, the Mando deck. I think this deck's stonks are quite down. Even 5% might be overselling its popularity, just because this deck has some like natural tournament level futziness in terms of playing it, managing clock, ensuring that how to play quickly despite the fact that you have 18 cards in your hand, and all that sort of thing. Scared of the mirror match, not concluding in like a real fashion. There's all sorts of like practical, not wanting to get a draw. Like draws at this event are basically losses. So in addition to the tournament level futziness that's occurring with this deck, I think it's also just like kind of lost its positive metagame position. So all the more reason for people not to bring this deck. I think that it's still quite powerful, and even like I said this last week, but I do think it will be like underplayed relative to its like inherent strength. But I think this week, just because you hate the fact that Ahsoka Vader, as I keep mentioning, are on the rise, very much so on the decline, this Mando deck. But nonetheless, I still think this deck is a pretty reasonable contender, and I can definitely see a world where it just kind of free rolls its way into top cut, similar to the Boba Fett example that I gave, just because most every deck on this tier list has some like bad matchups somewhere. So every deck can lose, every deck loses to something. It's a really tough meta in terms of picking something solid that you feel is addressing the entire field well. So yeah, just like update to my previous thinking, like I still am of the opinion that this format is quite difficult to solve. It's very difficult to find a deck that has just like an even matchup spread, and the reason for this is just like that disrespecting Cad is very, very, is like a horrible horribly scary proposition. Uh, Even though Cad is soft into space, and like I don't think it's a very good deck moving into this event. Like you still expect it to be the highest leader based player, like in spite of this. So your ability to pick a deck with a bad Cad matchup is tough, and then like your ability to take a good Cad matchup and be good into everything else is like quite strenuous. It's like there are just like too many decks to beat at the moment. So in terms of taking a deck that just like has no losing matchups or has everything like manageable, it's in my opinion, like maybe like not even one of those kinds of formats. It's a format where matchups are important, and just picking the best bad matchup to have is going to be, one of the stories of this event. So as I said earlier, like space is continuing to be important, continuing to be a very popular response to everything that's going on. You want to make sure that like not only if you are playing a non-space deck that you have tested these matchups extensively, but if you are playing a space deck, I think one of the most important things is just going to be like which is the best space deck to end up picking, right? Luke has advantages into Vader, and I think goes even with Boba, but like, is that worth giving up your like deck's ceiling into the other matchups in the room? Like, I'm not sure about that. So it's a big question mark that I have, especially like how this Vader Boba matchup goes, like when all is said and done. I think whichever of those two is better into the other will be like an incredibly like well positioned deck at this tournament. So I think that's what's going on there. And in terms of performance, as I keep saying, Cad Blue, I've not found a list that has felt very comfortable into space yet. So I continue to be of the opinion that if there's no evolution to like what this deck is doing, it should perform pretty poorly. But I have seen like some attempts to like speed it up and bring it into competition with the space deck. So it's just a question of like if that's a real way to play the deck, or if that's like just mutating your deck too far and still not like getting you all of the way there. So I want to look out for that. That is very, very important for this tournament. If the like Corellian Hounds like race with Ogdo Bogdo type example is the way that you beat space, I think the deck's position is like once again like totally fine. But I'm just like it's not an argument that I feel is I'm not like quite as comfortable with that as I would have liked to be. And then finally, just as I've mentioned before, Mando in general is down this week, unfortunately, because of the prevalence of these like fast, wide, aggressive decks. And I wanted to make sure like I update that because I think it's very much the case going into this event. Okay, so that's all I've got today. I think I said it was going to be a shorter video. I've probably rambled something to the tune of 30 minutes and change, but I don't know. I wish everyone luck at this tournament. It'll be fun. It'll be a wonderful time, and I'm excited to see, like, again, like just how everything shakes out and what the final progressions of the meta will be. Thank you as always for watching. It's been a real joy to make all this metagame content leading up to the event. Come watch my panel. It'll be a great time, and I'll catch you on the next.